It's important to take a moment to examine the relationship that exists in our culture today between religion and science, and to examine it in relation to the discipline of anthropology. Take a moment and look over this material with me. Let's take a look at this first point. Religion and science should be considered mutually exclusive in nature, even though the role that these systems play in our everyday life and how we explain the world around us is similar. Their structural grounding makes them incompatible. In science, hypotheses, theories, and even the models through which we understand the world around us are not compatible with the concept of faith or belief. In addition to this, human expressions that are considered to be religious are an important part of culture. They've helped us to survive throughout our history. Faith-based explanations of the world are not to be considered unimportant or inappropriate. The explanations that we receive from our religious institutions and culture should be judged in the same way that we judge science, equal and both appropriate. For the purpose of this course, students are challenged to learn the scientific explanations assigned to the history and prehistory of primates and primate-like forms. However, the material described in this lecture and any subsequent lectures is not to be considered religious in nature. Rather, it is a system of explanation that guides current research in the discipline of biological or physical anthropology. We'll begin our look at the evolution of primates through this secular lens with geography. Geography, as you can imagine, is the backdrop for all biological interactions that are described in your book and described here in this lecture. The physical geography of the planet, in this case, provides us with a sense of place and space. This is geographic in nature. And it provides us with a sense of time, a time to evaluate, in this case, patterns of extinction and biological development as it relates to the biological order. The perspective that evolutionary biologists take when they look at the growth and development of any living form is demographic in nature. Evolution is a populational concept. And in Darwin's words, it is descent with modification. But again, this is on a populational level. Lastly, the physical geography of the planet and its long-term history is used by evolutionary biologists to explain the major biomes of the planet, including the diversity that we see in the Primates order. The assumption that must be made here, and that is generally made by evolutionary biologists, is that the continental bodies that comprise the known world today have had a different relationship with one another geographically over time. This is explained through continental drift and the idea of tectonic movement. At the very dawn of the evolutionary story of primates, we recognize a geological time period known as an epoch. An epoch in this case relates to the reversal of planetary paleomagnetism. The first geological epoch that we recognize in the evolution of primates is referred to as the Paleocene, beginning 65 million years ago. It is within geological deposits associated with the Paleocene epoch that paleoprimatologists and paleoanthropologists recognize proto-primate forms. The proto-primate forms that have been recovered from geological deposits associated with the Paleocene have been organized into 5 extinct, fully fossilized families. For this lecture, we'll be focusing on one of the 5 families as a major contributor to the earliest true primate forms. This particular family is referred to as Plesiadapidae. Some paleoprimatologists have organized this body type and the biodiversity that we see in these populations of extinct proto-primates into a particular taxonomic grade, often referred to as Plesiadapiformes. This can be considered an infraorder within a developing proto-primate group. For the purpose of this lecture, however, please remember that it is the Plesiadapids that will be of primary importance to our overview of primate evolution. And within that family, the genus Plesiadapis is going to be a type fossil or a fossil of greatest importance. So this type fossil, this genus distinction, Plesiadapis, places the beginning of our primatological story 65 million years ago. This means that primates have a developmental history of approximately 65 million years. And it is continental drift that seems to isolate or restrict certain elements of the population in such a way to allow them to develop over time into what we see today in terms of the biodiversity of this order. Plesiadapis then would be considered to be a extinct genus of pre- or proto-primate forms whose primary food resource would have been insects in a tropical or paratropical climate. Its body type would have been very similar to the North American squirrel in its overall size. And in terms of its behavioral ecology, or daily behavioral life, it would be considered to be an arboreal quadruped. It would live in trees and locomote generally on forelimbs and hind limbs, 4 legs. As you can imagine, the changing climates become an important backdrop in understanding how populations develop over time. Let's briefly discuss the climate model. When we look at the environment, the climatological environment that Plesiadapids are thriving in, this generally is considered to be a tropical environment. Global warming was constant. It occurred throughout the Paleocene epoch and spread, in this case, plant and animal biomes that seem to have been, or continue to be, adapted to a paratropical or tropical forest environment. When we compare the geological deposits of this time period, between places like Europe and North America, we realize that because of continental shift and because of their general similar locations with regards to planetary latitudes, that climates in places like Europe and North America were very similar. The system of classification that paleoclimatologists attempting to reconstruct these epochs and their environments use compares patterns of rainfall and temperature. Most paleoprimatologists today recognize tropical and tropical savanna climate types to be the backdrop for most of this primatological evolutionary trend. Tropical climates, whether they are fully forested or if they are tropical savanna environments, exhibit varying degrees of the following qualities, many of which are associated with long-term patterns of weather. When we take a look at the soils, very often these soil types, such as oxysols, are iron-rich. However, their soil horizons are relatively shallow. Water surpluses and droughts are common to these areas. And if forests are present, generally they are thickly canopied and rich in terms of their overall biological diversity. So these forests are lush and often dominated by broadleaf plant types. Finally, we have temperature. Average annual temperatures in tropical climate environments, again, whether they are heavily forested or in a savanna environment, generally will express mean or average annual temperatures of between 60 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, given this biological, populational, and climatological backdrop, what are some of the major events which are important to the early evolution of primates? Well, as I mentioned before, we have a nice breeding pool out of which the primatological forms of later epochs can be drawn. In this case, 5 fossilized families of pre-primate or primate-like forms that appear in those Paleocene deposits. Following this, as we move into another epoch, which we'll talk about in just a moment, the Eocene epoch, we start to have true primatological forms. We'll talk about what particular traits and characteristics are associated with true primate forms. And then between 55 and 35 million years ago, there are 2 diverging populations of extinct primate forms that are present in the primatological record. With the dawn of a new epoch, in this case the Eocene epoch, we start to see some amazing trends in the overall biology of what many paleoprimatologists come to conclude are true primates, or euprimates, or members of this euprimates expression. Between 55 and 36 million years ago, we see the reemergence across the entire planet of large-bodied mammals adapted for cooler temperatures than what we saw in the Paleocene epoch. Among true primate forms, we see the emergence of a fully fossilized genus distinction, in this case recognized to be genus Cantius. Anatomists looking at Cantius material recognize nails as being present as opposed to claws. They recognize a fully enclosed eye orbit as part of the overall trait expression of this genus distinction, and they recognize some opposability or grasping ability in the forelimbs and hind limbs of this particular group of forms. To make sense of the body types that we recognize in the Paleocene and these new primatological or primate body types that we see emerging in the Eocene epoch, there is an additional concept I want to share with you at this time. Richard Kay, working out of Duke University, concluded that larger-bodied primates, those in this case of 350 grams or more, were probably not primarily insectivorous in terms of their diets. Additionally, he concluded that these larger-bodied animals were unable to dissipate heat as quickly as those who expressed smaller body types and ultimately had higher metabolisms. This means that the squirrel-like qualities of the plesiadapids, who we recognized to be pre- or proto-primate in nature of the Paleocene epoch, would have been at a disadvantage during the Eocene epoch. Larger-bodied primates who were able to adapt to a wider range of food types would have had the advantage. As a result, as time moves on, as we begin to move through Eocene deposits, we start to see body types that seem to agree with Kay's threshold or Richard Kay's ideas. In this case, we have 2 new families that emerged during the Eocene. A variety of forms are organized into Adapidae and Omamiidae. We refer to them as Adapids and Omamiids. Many paleoprimatologists today consider the Adapids, the Adapid forms, or members of the fossilized family in the Eocene Adapidae, to be ancestral to the living lemurs and African and Asian prosimians. There is a problem, though, because we recognize Adapid-like forms reaching places like Madagascar as early as 60 million years ago, before the Eocene. Whatever the case is, we know that Adapids, at least those that would have remained in more tropical environments, would have increasingly been stressed as climates became cooler and cooler, and they would have been required to have a much more diverse diet in order to survive. Here is an artist's rendition of what a typical Adapid body type would have looked like. The clear winners, at least in this Eocene epoch, would have been the Omamiids. These extinct true primates would have expressed varying degrees of the following traits. When we compare them to other Eocene and, of course, Paleocene forms, we would recognize that the midface and lower face would begin to taper or diminish in its overall size. We would see a post-orbital bar or complete closure to the eye orbits. The size of the brain in relation to the overall body size would have been considerably larger. We would see a primate or primate-like middle ear morphology. This helps with balance and locomotion. And we would have seen a poorly defined expression of sexual dimorphism, or the differences, the physical differences between males and females within a select population. Some of the traits associated with this reduction in sexual dimorphism, again, traits between males and females, would have been things like reduced canines or similar body sizes. Ultimately, what we are left with by the end of the Eocene epoch, at least these deposits that we associate with the Eocene, are true primates, and true primates that seem to be best represented by one particular family, in this case the Omamiids. Let's step back for just a moment and look at what true primate traits are. This is a composite of both traits we see in living primates today and those that we recognize in the primate record or the fossilized record. This would include the morphology of the middle ear, in this case 3 unique bones to the middle ear. We would see things like collarbones, forward-facing eye orbits that are fully enclosed, separate bones of the lower arm and lower leg, fingernails and toenails, grasping hands and feet, or the opposability that we see in hands and feet among many primates today, and then a tendency toward vertical posture. Then in terms of behaviors, and again, when we're talking about primate behaviors, we really have to only look at, in this case, the living record and superimpose some of these behaviors on the fossil record. But let's take a look at what a typical kind of primate behavioral ecology would be. In this case, we recognize primates today as having longer lives in relation to other large mammals and longer periods of specific life stages, things like infant dependency, for example. In addition to this, we see the effects that enlarged brains may have had on the behavioral ecology of primates. In this case, even specific areas of the brain that become enlarged over time relative to body size. In this case, the general trend that we associate with living and deceased primates is that there would have been a greater reliance on sight, or those areas of the brain that are associated with sight and even sound would have expanded in terms of their size and ultimately how they functioned. What we would have seen then corresponding to this would have been a reduction in the areas of the brain associated with scent or smell.